What's your story? I have no doubt that if I ask you that about your personal life, you won't start by saying, I am a member of the human race, or I am a human being in general, or even I am an American. You're likely to tell me who your parents are and where you live and what your work is. In other words, you're going to start very close to home. We all have that impulse and instinct to measure things most important if they're near us. Even if an airplane goes down a couple miles north of the Canadian border, if you're a U.S. citizen, it somehow seems a little less your story than if it's a few miles on this side of that border. That may not be the prettiest image of the human race, but it's the case. If it's a matter of rescuing our own child or giving money to rescue somebody in India, you know which we're going to do. We try to get a global vision, and yet we always start close to home. So, as far as your Christian story is concerned, if I'd start by asking you about it, odds are you talk about your own personal life, your prayer life, your experience, things you've gone through, or whatever. And maybe you'd get as far as your local congregation or parish, or some Christian movement of which you're a part, and then maybe a denomination, and finally you do what you say in the Creed, you believe that there's one holy Catholic, holy Christian church around the world. Well, when you're going to talk about what's become of the Christian story, we have to remember that larger perspective as well. And that larger perspective is a little hard to come by. Again, I think we in the United States and in North America tend to think this is the homeland of Christianity, and we send out missionaries from here, and we send out development programs, and we send out food and healing. It's not quite that way. If you get a global perspective, the larger image, you don't just measure things from your own church tower. Just take numbers, for example. Africa. In the last 24 hours, sub-Saharan black Africa has 16,000 more Christians than it did 24 hours ago. And in the northern world, our part of the world, Europe and America, there are probably 3,000 fewer along the way. So we better pay attention. 2000 after Christ, there are believed to be about 343 million Christians in Africa. Hold on to that figure, because then you go to Latin America, combining the Catholic Church that's been there for 5 centuries and the evangelical Protestants and the mainline Protestants and the new movements. Add them all up, you're going to have 470 million. Asia, we think of as Buddhist territory, communist territory, Hindu territory, but add up the Christians of the subcontinent and the rim of Asia, and you're going to get 301 million, according to the atlases and computers and census for the year 2000. Europe, tired old Europe with a lot of empty churches, 536 million. We don't count them quite as enthusiastically as the others. They have a lot to relearn if they want to be a part of global Christianity in new ways, but still, they are the parent of so much of the rest of it. Well, after all those 343s and 470s and 301s and 536s, where are we? North America, 220 million. Rather puny, way down the list. Very important, it's our home. But let's for a moment stretch and talk about how the Christian church came to be a global phenomenon, and not just what one great Catholic of the 1930s said when he said, Europe is the faith and the faith is Europe. Today the whole world is involved with the Christian story, and we're a part of it. I moved very rapidly in thinking of what stories are like, from the most intimate to the global, from the idea of a family and a personal life to hundreds of millions of people in different continents. And that's quite a leap, and what we have to learn if we want to see how these interact is to find different perspectives, different ways of listening, different ways of looking. I spend my life doing this in several different ways, and I try to teach my students to think of looking at the Christian church the way they look at a hurricane, or the forces against the Christian church as the way they look at a storm, the hurricane. There are really 4 vantages. The one, when I use the hundreds of millions figure, is what happens when we go into a satellite image. When you see a hurricane coming, you see these silvery ribbons in the Caribbean. You're 30,000 miles away from them. That's pretty safe. You can get closer. You get closer as you do in a C-130, where you have all the measuring instruments, but you move in the eye of the hurricane with the hurricane. You're pretty safe. We've never lost a C-130. More dangerous is the vision from right close on the ground. The bridge tender who sees to it the last people are leaving the island. Or the physicians and nurses who can't leave the island. Or the people in the boats who would have to take them across, or the police, or the weather people. They can't leave, though they know all about it. That's a close-up and dangerous view, but an important one for getting the story. And then finally, for the 1.8 billion, it's the vision of the people in the hut itself, each little hut, where you could put up the plywood and get out the sandbags and know the storm is coming. And you might be devastated by it, or you might get out of town. We may live on all those levels, and for the moment, I'm starting with that satellite vision. A very different picture when you talk of how the Christian church moves around the world. How did it get there? Today, with the slippage, if you will, into the southern hemisphere or into the poor world, I often like to picture the old paint advertisements. We cover the earth, and it showed a kind of a gravitational pull of the drops of paint from the northern to the southern world. That's part of what's happening on the C-130, or the satellite image of what's going on in America and in the world. How did it get there? In a little while, we'll do a little close-up of the missionaries. It got there really in two ways. It got there by conversion or the sword. A very distasteful part of the Christian story is when it got there by the sword. A king would be converted, he'd be baptized, and he made everybody else follow. Clovis of the Franks, today's French people, was baptized, and so all his people had to be. Olaf Tryggvason, 1,000 years ago, the most feared Viking, was not out after gold, he was out after souls once he was converted. When he found the king who had killed his father, he forced an adder, a poison adder down the throat. It didn't kill the man, so they put a hot grill on him, and that killed him. And Olaf would take his sword and turn to the other tribe and say, "Now you have a choice, be baptized or be killed." Well, given those odds, you know what you would have chosen, I suppose, and that's what we call the conversion of the North. Through the years, though, the conversions that stuck were one at a time, as people came to accept the story of Jesus and make it their own. You can't have the great global shift in the location of Christianity without a great deal of change. And we, in our kitchens and our local churches, are being changed all the time, and our stories grow by the fact of these great Christian changes around the world. What occasions the change? Well, if you've been in Africa and you've been a nature worshiper, if you will, and then you are converted to Christ and you become a part of the church, you're very different than if you were a European, where you got your Catholicism or your Protestantism mixed with Plato and Aristotle. I could go to church 10 years and not hear the words Plato and Aristotle, but if I've studied them, I know good and well that a lot of the concepts we're using are colored by that. Even our attitudes toward the physical world around us. Somebody said you can't have the physical side of the Christian faith unless you have a loaf of bread, a bottle of wine, and a river. But you can't have a bottle of wine everywhere except by importing it. And I remember a meeting in 1960 of people of the churches around the world where an African bishop got up and said, would you help us through this problem? We know that we're supposed to use the fruit of the vine, but grapes don't grow in our country, and when we're at war, we can't import grape juice or wine. But we have sweet potatoes, and they are a kind of a vine, and we can make a sweet potato brandy. Would that be all right? Do you think Jesus would have approved of that? And we laughed. We thought it was trivial, thought it was humorous. But it's very real if you are in that situation. And we're learning a good deal more about taking those situations seriously. You see it in our art. Nowadays, we know that if there's a painting of the Nativity or the Holy Family in Korea, Jesus is no longer going to look like a blonde European, the way the blonde Europeans painted him. He's going to look like a Korean. People paint Jesus with their own brush, and they interpret the faith in those terms. So it is with music. A hymn book in almost any church body in America today is going to include some hymns from South Africa, from Venezuela, from the Philippines, or whatever. And they become a part of our thinking without our hardly even knowing it, till we sing them as readily as anything else along the way. So I think we all have to be ready for these great changes that come, and our stories will grow in the light of these experiences. When we get to the story of how Christianity came to move from Europe to the whole globe, we get into a lot of controversy. One of the great modern storytellers of Christianity called the 19th century the Great Century, because it expanded into all the world through a burst of energy unseen before. I know plenty of people, historians, who tell the story of that as the ugly century, a bad time. Why? Because exploiters, colonial powers went into all the world, and with their Christian missionaries along the way, they disrupted nice old cultures, and they tried to convert people of no faith or of other faiths. And what business did they have to do that? We're outside the Divinity School of the University of Chicago, where, say, 70 years ago, classes were full of people who wanted to go into China, India, or wherever. Maybe not so much to convert anymore. They were Protestant liberals, and they didn't have that so much in mind. They went to start universities and colleges and elementary schools and high schools, but they went to start the hospitals and staff them. But it was mission, very much it was mission. Today, at this kind of school, you would find instead that they study world religions, history of religions. They study the way cultures meet. And in that, very often, the missionaries are the bad guys and bad women. Why? Again, because there were other religions there, and now they crashed in upon them. You can see, therefore, that the Christian story sort of divides here depending upon how you regard what's going on. But we'll never understand it unless we get to the huts, to the people that are converted, saved, made a part of the church, and those bridge tenders and other people I talked about at hurricane time who know the story and are on the scene all the time. And then it turns out to be a good deal different. Suppose you'd ask one of them, why are you here? I can't picture many of them saying, because England has to take over India and I have to justify it, because they want to plant the flag there and I want to plant the cross there with the flag. Certainly that was part of what happened. But I think most of them would answer quite honestly, as anyone who reads their diaries could say, they went because they heard there was a great commission. Jesus had said to the disciples in one of the Gospels, go into all the world and preach the gospel, baptizing people. And they thought if that was the command, they should do it. And Jesus had given the promise that he would be with them, and they did it, and that became their story. And so they went and they did it. They would say, we are doing it to save souls, to fill up heaven, to enlarge the number of people who will be there. And we're going to make their bodies more whole and their minds more alert. How can you fault us for that? One of the people, I think, who had a kind of an interesting view of this was Adlai Stevenson, who had no special investment at all in Christian missions. But in the 1950s, he was the United Nations ambassador from the United States. And on a trip to Africa, he was taken around by some people in the new churches that spring up there, out to the old graveyard where the 19th century missionaries and their husbands or their wives and their children were buried. And he came back and he said, the thing that impressed me was the graves. Oh, the graves, all the graves. What struck him was that people would not have gone to such lengths of catching tropical diseases and so on if, in spite of condescension, in spite of wrong interpretations, they had not loved the people that they were there with. And there are many records in their diaries and letters of that. So, yes, don't forget the story of misuse of power and of colonialism and of tromping on other people. But the story also has to say, let's get up close to the people who went for a variety of reasons, very often of Christian love. And then a lot of them came home. World War I, World War II, they were unwelcome. Nation after nation might have closed the door to them. Iron curtains fell and no more missionaries could go. China closed and the missionaries had to go home. And what happened? The church grew. Interestingly, the story of the Christian church grew after the missionaries went home. They told the stories of Jesus, and they told these stories, and they planted churches, often with some little success. And today there's quite a burst of what are called the indigenous churches, the churches that grow up on their own soil. If you really want a word to clear your throat, they're autochthonic churches. They are out of the dirt and the soil of a place itself. Africanity, African Christianity, Latin American Christianity. I visited some of these churches in South Africa alone. The African Indigenous Church numbered at that time over 2,000 separate, shall we call them churches, sects, prophetic movements. A prophet would rise and get a vision, often Pentecostal, and gather a group, and soon they had the structure of another church. I said, it's nice to be here in the AIC, the African Independent Church. And they said, independent of what? We're the indigenous churches. we've grown up on our own. And they have their own flavor, and they want to be tied to the rest of the world. I remember one time when my wife and I were in South Africa, and I had preached in a little Methodist colored church, very poor people. The minister would sing a line, a jazz pianist would play a line, and they would sing. They couldn't afford hymn books. And we were invited to a home after a while, a home with 6 sons that served us tea and cookies, and we were thanking them for that. I learned later that they'd eaten nothing but potatoes since Thursday of that week, and the minister had paid for the tea so they could have dignity. When they left, we felt we'd gotten so much from them. My wife and I said, now what can we do for you? You've done so much for us. Oh, do what you do all the time. Just pray for us every Sunday the way you're doing it now. And we both gulped because we weren't sure that we had them that much in mind. But every such trip gives us more reason to have them in mind, and we do. And when you see the church in South Africa or in India or in Latin America, where the new growth is present, you also see that the mission doesn't just mean saving souls, doesn't mean just preaching, if I can use the word just in both cases, but it means taking care of the whole person. Many, many of these places, the distribution system for medicine, the education, the building of colleges and universities has been in the hands of the churches that are the great-great-granddaughters of these 19th century missionaries. If they weren't on the scene, more would die, more would be hungry, more would be unsheltered, more would be in ignorance. So the story of the Christian mission, if it is your own, or if you want to make it your own and own up to it, is an ambiguous story of good motivation and bad, of weakness in Christ and power of the imperial powers. It's mixed that way, but to me it's also the story of people doing the works of justice and mercy and spreading good news, and thus enlarging the Christian story in surprising places. Maybe I've sounded too sweet about the story of Christian expansion in the world, the great century, because the dark side of that was cutthroat competition. Christians who hardly recognized each other as sisters and brothers in Christ as they claimed to, but people that you wanted to beat out. You wanted to get there before the Catholics did, or the Catholics wanted to get there before the Baptists did, or whatever. Carving up a world where there are a couple billion people when this all started, and yet you wanted to be sure that you were the victor and the winner. And it almost appears, if you say that there are 25,000 separate denominations today, that they don't even share a common story at all, though there is at the heart a common story. It's almost like little balls of mercury spreading all over the place. But that's not the end of the story. In fact, the story as I'm telling it and you're living it is not ending. The next phase of the story was the search for unity, because the time came when the mission expansion and the cutthroat competition was self-defeating. A very famous story is told about the 1930s when the low caste in India, led by a Dr. Ambedkar, showed signs of restlessness in their kind of Hinduism. They were tromped on by everybody. That's what it means to be low caste. And along came these Christians talking about the human dignity and justice and God's love and all that would follow. Bishop Azariah met this Dr. Ambedkar, and they talked about it and how you could have this story of Jesus as your own. And in the end, the spokesperson for the low caste said, you know, in our misery, we're at least united. If we became Christian, we would then be divided. Well, those kinds of stories throughout the 20th century kept coming back to the old home bases in Europe and America. And they induced a lot of people to work into change. Beginning in 1910, at a famous missionary conference in Edinburgh, where they decided this has gone far enough, we have to find patterns of working close together. Whoever looks at the story of the last 2 centuries might think that the 19th century was one of the centrifugal force, out of a center into all the world, becoming global. And the 20th century is a time of centripetality, trying to find the center again, letting gravitational pull come toward the center of that story, because it shows up in people baptizing and recognizing each other's baptisms, trying more and more to commune at each other's altars, trying to blend their stories along the way. And then all of a sudden, from under the surface, we find a lot of old discontent still showing. Many of them are men versus women, rich world versus poor world, or rich anywhere in the world versus poor, or different races and different ethnic groups at great distance from each other, having a hard time getting their stories to blend. So I suppose you could look out in pessimism, and you want me to cheer you up and say, be optimistic, and that's foolish. Both of those are foolish options. Be realistic, one would say, as you look at the story, and be full of hope. Realistic hope isn't a bad way to look at the turn into the new millennium and the charter. And if anyone looks at the Christian story with realistic hope, eyes wide open, and eyes also on the horizon and on the future, it doesn't take long until you say of this Christian story, this Christian thing that begins with the biblical story of Jesus and carries on into our own time, it has a plot. And what's interesting about that plot is it's unfinished. And as individuals and as groups, you're in that plot. It is your story, and you're adding to it.